Phil Craig, good to be talking with you again. The Cape Independence Advocacy Group is planning a march. Now, this could be something interesting. I suppose it's going to give us an understanding of how many people are actually supporting the independence of the Cape. Why are you risking this? So we know that Cape Townians are notoriously apathetic, particularly if the weather's good.
Yeah, look, that's the case. Look, this isn't our first march. We had a march in December 2020 was our last march in Clutersville, just outside of Stellenbosch, and actually we marched into Stellenbosch. We haven't been able to march between them for a long time because then of the lockdown regulations went down to a maximum of 50 people. So we've been waiting for this. So look, a march is always difficult, but I think it's getting people motivated, and I think Cape Town does have a degree of apathy for those things. But I think we're going to see a really good number of people there, and I think we'll they'll represent the Cape Independence movement very well. And it's not just the CIAG; it's not just us that's organising the march. We're organising the march in conjunction with Cape Exit and with the Freedom Front and the Cape Independence Party. So the four of us are organising the march between us.
Where is it?
In Cape Town itself, at 11 o'clock at the Grand Parade, right next to the castle, and then we're walking on a circular route that'll take us past the provincial legislature, past Parliament, past the District 6 Museum, and then back to finish at the Grand Parade again.
Why?
Why? So I think for many reasons, but I think one is look, we're in an interesting political landscape now. Post the local government elections, there's a lot of focus on coalition government. I think initially there was then all of a sudden perhaps a slightly unrealistic hope that fantastic, we've finally got the ANC under 50%. I think probably the reality of coalition government is starting to dawn on people now, and I think we certainly don't really see 2024 as a victorious moment in South African history. But it's important to let people know that look, we've got this option, and particularly in the Western Cape, where we don't need coalition government. We've got a functional government that's in its third straight term with a clear majority, and we just need it to govern. So that is a big part of this for us. And then, as you said in the intro, we want to keep the DA honest. They've made certain promises, running up to the local government elections, and the independence movement and the DA have accommodated each other fairly well, given that we've got very similar views, but certainly there are differences, that significant differences over independence. But we found a way of accommodating ourselves, and that's been around the democratic will of the Western Cape people. So we're actually handing over a petition to Premier Alan Winde to thank them for the referendum legislation, and that the fact that they have said they will give us a question on Cape independence in a referendum. But there's obviously a slight edge to that, in that they haven't actually brought the legislation yet. They've announced it, they've called for comments, but they haven't tabled it in Parliament. So there's also a slight edge that says, look, you also have to get on with that. We've made this arrangement, so let's make sure that it happens, and that legislation is now overdue, and we need to make sure it comes.
What would you consider to be a good turnout?
Well, we've got we've got a permit for 2,000 people. So that's the maximum that we're allowed to have under the current regulations. And I think anything that gets anything that starts to get up to towards the let's say over 1,000 would be a fantastic turnout, I think, and it may well be that we get to the 2,000. I mean, it's always an unknown quantity, but I mean, we've got people who have the indications on our groups and our things are always much stronger, and we've seen before that the number of people who say they're going to come and the number of people who actually turn up tend to vary. But at this point in time, we certainly would have the full allocation of 2,000 people saying that they intend to come. Whether they all turn up on a public holiday remains to be seen. But I think there'll be a good number.
So this is on Wednesday. It's Freedom Day. So I guess for what you're trying to promote, it's got to be possibly the best day of the year, because you're looking for freedom of the Cape. Is it? And we often have interesting discussions, or we have had over the recent past. Is it being taken seriously now, Cape independence? Because when Helen Zille was at our BizNews conference, We spoke off the record about it, and she certainly isn't a great supporter, either privately or publicly, of this idea. Rather, in her view, is South Africa as a whole should become independent of the ANC, as it were.
Sure. Sure. So, look, is it being taken seriously? Yes. Is it being taken seriously enough? Probably no. But I mean that's a process. So I think the DA have their challenges in that 70% of their, as they'll tell you, 70% of their voters are outside of the Western Cape. So they have this slight conundrum where they'll concede two things. They'll concede that the majority of their voters in the Western Cape would support Cape independence, but actually they have these concerns outside of the Western Cape, and we've actually pushed them, and we'd love them to poll their own voters, because everything we've got, every anecdotal piece of evidence we have, would suggest that there's massive support for Cape independence outside of the Western Cape, and I think the DA are slightly missing a trick there. But look, that's where we are. We accept it. I think in terms of ourselves and the DA as the Western Cape provincial government, there's a lot of similarities. We fundamentally think we're living in a failing state. We fundamentally think that there's not a very bright future unless some radical change happens. They want to see that radical change as federalism. They want to see that as devolution of powers, going as far as a devolution of tax powers to the Western Cape. But they would ultimately see the Western Cape remaining as a part of South Africa, and I think that's a nod to the voters outside of the province. We actually have no gripe with any of those policies. We agree with that. We just want to go one step further. We don't think federalism will actually take us far enough, and we have question marks on whether it's actually deliverable. But we're willing to work with the DA to get that as the first step. So I think in terms of that, but and I think this is where we come down to the edge. Then there is going to come the point in time where the Cape independence movement will have to make a fundamental decision about how far can we walk this journey with the provincial government, and people forget that as a movement we haven't actually brought everything into play, and we work together as a group of exits, a group of Cape independence organisations, and bear in mind that our partner Cape Exit is sitting with a database that's got has got the names and addresses and email addresses and contact numbers and ID numbers of 1 in 4 Western Cape voters. If we decide to not cooperate with the DA and just allow people to decide for themselves, but we decide to confront the DA politically, it's going to be a very, very different situation. And that's how we've got to this referendum legislation so far. We've never chosen to take that route. Actually, we'd much rather collaborate and build consensus. But the people of the Western Cape cannot be held to ransom by the people outside of South Africa. And that can't be to South African voters, but neither can it be to the DA. So at some point in time, the DA are going to have to come off the fence. Not necessarily, we would never ask them to support Cape independence. What we've asked them to do is to support a referendum, to bring the legislation and to allow the people of the Western Cape to decide for themselves. And actually, the DA have indicated they're willing to do that. They just need to do it. And obviously, if they don't, then the game starts to change from our side.
Phil, it's very obvious that the semigration trend is accelerating from other parts of the country, particularly KwaZulu-Natal, and I'm sure that the latest floods are going to just add further momentum to that. But are you finding that your greatest supporters, or the supporters of the Cape Independence advocacy group, come from long-time Capetonians or long-time Western Cape residents, or are the newcomers to the province, these people who have semigrated into the province, more active in that, given that they've actually uprooted themselves from other parts of South Africa to vote with their feet with a part of the country that is ruled by the DA rather than the ANC?
I'm going to tell you that a third group of people are actually the most fervent Cape independence supporters, and they're the people who haven't moved yet but intend to, and they are our biggest funders. They are our most vocal supporters, because I think in some ways the people of the Western Cape are slightly spoilt because we're insulated from the worst of the failing state by a pretty functional provincial government. People that have moved here, it's great and they can see the differences, but actually to a certain extent they've arrived. I think the people who are left in that failing failing, decaying state. And they want somewhere to go to. I think in many ways those people are the greatest supporters of Cape independence, the most, not greatest supporters, I think, but the most active, because I think for them it's the most real. And we've often, I think we've talked on this show before, I've often used the analogy of the Western Cape being the equivalent of an Israel for Jewish people. It's an ideological homeland for people who want to have these Western values, this capitalist. I don't mean naked capitalism, but I mean this functional, business orientated first world country in Africa, and they've got this set of values, and those people aren't defined by race, they're defined by an ideology, and we see that in how they vote. And actually, and increasingly we're having this situation where we're having this kind of reversion of parts of Africa into sort of African nationalism, and actually we've got these people for whom that just doesn't represent them, of all races. They say, look, actually no, we don't want that. We're effectively, we're Western, we're first world, we want to work in a functional, business friendly environment where everything works, and that's the divide that we're getting. And ultimately this semigration is very much people who are just moving towards that. And semigration is in many ways a physical representation of the thought processes that go behind Cape independence. It's perhaps more subtle, but it's the same thing. It's an understanding that we had a tweet recently that causes a bit of hot water, but we put out a graphic that said we're just different. And that's the reality. The Western Cape is just different from the rest of South Africa, and our argument remains the same, that South Africa must be governed by the people who live there. They must elect their own government to be governed the way they want to be. But the Western Cape fundamentally wants something different, and we must be governed the way that we want to be governed.
Just refresh me. How many people in the Western Cape, according to your polls and the research you've done, are in favour of Cape independence?
Well, the last poll was in July last year, so it's slightly dated now. But at that point in time, it was 46.2% of Western Cape voters, and I think 42% of people over the age of 18 were in support of Cape independence. So we were short of a majority, but we were getting close, and that number is just going to keep on growing as we get nearer and nearer. The number in support of referendum last time I think was 53%. That's amongst all voters in the Western Cape. When we polled Western Cape DA voters, it was massively higher. It was 2/3 wanting a referendum and an outright majority wanting Cape independence. So it's a sizable number. And then we put that in terms of Cape Exit, who have collected these mandates, which are detailed. Effectively, it's an opt-in database of people who want Cape independence, and they give their information. And actually, like I say, that number is about 825,000 people now, which would be 1 in 4. It'd be more than 1 in 4, but allowing that all of those people live in the Western Cape. I think around about 700 or 750,000 of those people are based in the Western Cape. So we know from both polling and from mandates that this is a huge number. And obviously only when we have a referendum will we get the exact number. From our side, we just want to bring the referendum on and have it.
How far away is the referendum that you are agitating for?
Well, so look, and that's been a big disappointment for us, if I'm honest, with the DA. So they announced that they were bringing this referendum legislation in June, and there was some collaboration between us over that. That there was an agreement that they would do that, and they did. They submitted it to Parliament. They themselves said to us that they had an overwhelming response. In fact, Natasha Mazzoni said it was the greatest response they'd ever had to a private member's bill. It was overwhelmingly positive, and actually people weren't just putting in one-word answers; they were actually motivating for the reasons. So they said it was unprecedented, the level of support for the referendum legislation. Initially, they said they thought that was going to be tabled in November, and it wasn't. Then they talked about it being tabled towards the end of January and the beginning of February, and it hasn't been. Here we are in April, and that legislation still hasn't been tabled, and we're getting on to 10 months after they announced that they were going to table it. So there may be factors that we're not aware of, and actually we are due to meet with the DA again to find out what is happening with the referendum legislation. And everybody is telling us that it's their priority. It's absolutely their priority. They want to bring this legislation, because they want to call referendums much as we do. That they might want to have different topics, but they want the referendum legislation. But yeah, it's disappointing that it's taken this long, and I think there's more urgency than the DA have shown. Look, perhaps there's something I don't know about, but I mean, obviously there is the concern that the legislation has been slow walked towards 2024. It's given that we know that the DA have an eye on coalition governments in 2024, and I hope that's not the case. And certainly, if it turns out that is the case, then we'll make other plans, and there are other parties who can bring that legislation. So, it's that legislation is going to come.
But what makes you confident that that legislation allowing a referendum is going to be passed in Parliament?
Well, well, first of all, it's already in the Constitution. So the legislation is correcting a constitutional defect. Or a legislative defect. The current law is unconstitutional because the right that the legislation is giving voice to already exists. So it can be that perhaps there can be amendments to the wording, but there has to be a bill that has to be corrected. Parliament can't decide to not execute the Constitution. At AfriForum have already indicated that if Parliament doesn't pass the legislation, that they're going to take them to the Constitutional Court and force them to pass the legislation. So whether in this exact form gets passed remains to be seen. But the right already exists in the Constitution. This is just the enabling legislation. So the government can't not pass a Referendum Act.